Hello guys, Week here, and firstly, I would like to apologize about how long I have been gone. I've had a really eventful break. I just recently graduated from high school. I am now a high school graduate. I just had my birthday and um I turned 19 years old, so that was another big thing and other things in between. But yeah, I've had a very busy long weeks break, so I am super sorry about that. But let's get into it. The Tale of Emily Windsnap, and it's going to be chapter 14. Chapter 14. I swam cautiously away from the reef, glancing nervously around me as I moved ever closer to the prison. A solitary manta ray slid along the ground, flapping its fin like a cape. Small packs of moody-looking fish with open jaws threaded slowly through the silent darkness, glancing at me as they passed. Ahead of me, a barrel of thick blackness rotated slowly, then suddenly it parted. Thousands of tiny fish scattered and reformed into two spinning balls. Beyond them, a dark gray shadow bigger than me and shaped like a submarine moved silently between them. I held my breath as the shark passed by. As I grew near to the prison, the water grew darker. Dodging between rocks and weeds, I finally reached the prison door. It looked like the wide open mouth of a gigantic whale, with sharp white teeth filling the gap. In front of the door, two creatures silently glided from side to side, slow and mean, with beady eyes on each side of their mallet-shaped heads. Hammerhead sharks. I'd never get past them. Maybe there was another entrance. I remembered the note in Dad's file. East Wing, it had said. It was a shame there was one of those "You are here" signs, like you get at the mall. I figured I'd be heading west since I'd set off from Brightport, because I'd been chasing the setting sun all the way. Shona and I turned right from the boat to head toward the reef, which means I should be now facing north. I turned right against to go east. In front of me was a long tunnel attached to the main cave. It reminded me of those service stations on the highway, the kind on the mediation the kind on the median that joined the two sides together, apart from the fact that this was made of rock. That in that is, and it didn't appear to have any windows and was about 50 feet under the sea. The east wing, swimming carefully from one lump of coral to another and hiding behind every rock I could find. I made it to the tunnel, but there was no entrance. I swam all the way along it, right to the end. Still no opening. The front gate must be the only way in. I'd come this far for nothing. There was no way I'd get past those sharks. I started to swim back along the other side of the tunnel. Perhaps there'd be another doorway on the side. But as I made my way along the slimy walls, I heard a swishing noise behind me. The sharks! Without stopping to think, I flicked my tail and zoomed straight down the side, so I was underneath the tunnel itself. Pressing myself up against the wall, I wrapped a huge piece of seaweed around my body. Two hammerheads sliced past without stopping, and I inched my way back up again, scaling the edge with my hands, and looked around me all the way. A minute later, I noticed something I hadn't seen earlier. There was a gap. I could see an oval shape about half my height and slightly wider than my shoulders, with three thick gray bars running down it. They looked like whalebone, the nearest thing I'd found to a way in. It had to be worth a try. I tugged at the bars, rock solid. I tried to swim between them. I could get my head through, but not my shoulders. Were They were too big to follow. This wasn't going to work. Unless I swam through on my side. I tried again, coming at the bars sideways, but it was no good. I couldn't squeeze my face through the gap. I never realized my nose stuck out that much. I held out onto the bars, flicking my tail as I thought. Then it hit me. How could I have been so stupid? I turned to face them. Just like before, I edged my head through the bars, as slowly and carefully as I could. As I And all I needed to do was flip on my side and pull the rest of my body through. But what if I got stuck? My head on the other side, my body on the other, caught forever with my neck in these railings. Before I had any time to talk myself out of it, I swiveled my body onto its side. I banged my chin and my neck rubbed on the bars, but I'd done it. I swished my tail as gently as possible and gradually eased my body through the gap. I thought back to the time when we were changing to go swimming, and how I hadn't wanted anyone to see my skinny body. Maybe being a little stick-like wasn't such a bad thing after all. I rubbed my eyes as I got used to the darkness. I'd landed in a tiny round bubble of a room full of seaweed mops hanging on fish hooks all around me. I swam to the door and turned a yellow knob. The door creaked open. Which way? The corridor was a long, narrow cave. Closing the door behind me, I noticed a metal plate in the corner. NW 9874 North Wing. I must have gotten my calculations wrong. I swam along the silent corridors, passing closed doors on either side. N867, N865. Each one was the same, a big round plate of metal like a submarine door, a brass knob below a tiny round window in the center. No glass, just fishbone bars dividing each window into an empty game of tic-tac-toe. Should I look through one? As I approached the next door, I swished up to the window and peeked in. A merman with a huge hairy stomach and a long black hair and a ponytail swam over to the window. Can I help you? He asked, an amused glint in his eye. He had a ship tattooed on his arm. A fat brown tail flickered behind him. Sorry, I flipped myself over and darted away. This was impossible. I wasn't even the right wing, and there were scary criminals behind those doors, which was only to be expected, I suppose. This was a prison, after all. Suddenly, I heard a swishing noise. Hammerheads coming nearer. I flicked my tail as hard as I could and swam to the end of the corridor. I had to get around the bend before they saw me. With one last push of my tail, I zoomed through the corner into an identical tunnel. Identical except for one thing. The numbers all started with E. The E swing. I swam carefully up to the first door. E924. I tried to remember the first number from the note in Mr. Beeston's files. Why hadn't I written it down? An old merman with a beard and a raggedy limbed tail was inside the cell facing away from me. I moved on. E26, E926, E928. Would I ever find him? Just then, two mallet-shaped heads appeared around the corner. I hurled myself up against the next door, frantically twisting the brass knob. To my amazement, it wasn't locked. The door swung open, banking on the odds that whoever occupied it would be less scary than the sharks. I backed into the room and quietly shut the door. The whooshing noise came past in the moment I'd closed it. I leaned my head against the door in relief. That was a lucky escape. Who said that? I swung around to see a merman sitting on the edge of a bed made of seaweed. He was leaning over a small table and seemed to be working on something, his sparkly purple tail flickering gently. I looked at him, but I didn't move from the door. He appeared to put the end of a piece of thread in his mouth and then tied a knot on the other end. Got to keep myself busy somehow, he said, somewhat apologetically. I slunk around the edges of the bubble-shaped room, still keeping my distance. The thread he was sewing looked as if it was made of gold, with beads of some kind strung out in rainbow colors. You're making a necklace? Bracelet, actually. Got a problem with that. The merman looked up for the first time, and I backed away instinctively. Don't make fun of criminals whose cell you've just barged into, I told myself. Never a good idea if you're planning to get out in one piece. Except he didn't look like a criminal. Not how I usually imagine criminals to look, anyway. He didn't look mean and hard, and he was making jewelry. He had short black hair, kind of wavy, a tiny ring in one of his ears, and a white vest with blue prison jacket over it. His tail sparkled as much as his bracelet. As I looked at him, he ran his hand through his hair. There was something familiar about the way he did it, although I couldn't think what. I twiddled with my hair as I tried to. I looked harder at him. As he squinted back at me, I noticed a tiny dimple appear below his left eye. It couldn't be. The man put down the bracelet and slithered off his bed. I backed away again as he came toward me. I'll scream, I said. He stared at me. I stared back. How in the sea did you find me? He said in a different kind of voice from earlier. This one sounded like he had molasses blocking up his throat or somewhat. I looked at his face, deep brown eyes, my eyes. Dad? A tiny voice squeaked from over the other side of the cell somewhere. It might have been mine. The merman rubbed his eyes. And then he hit himself on the side of his head. I knew it would happen one day, he said to himself more than me. No one does time in this place without going a little bit crazy. He turned away from me. I'm dreaming, that's all. But then he turned back around. Pinch me, he said. Swimming closer, I recoiled a little. Pinch me, he repeated. I pinched him, and he jumped back. Youch! I didn't say pull my skin off. He rubbed his arm and looked up at me again. So you're real, he said. I nodded. He swam in a circle around me. You're even more beautiful than I dreamed, he said, and I've dreamed about you a lot, I can tell you. I still couldn't speak. I never wanted you to see me in this place. He swam around his cell, quite quickly putting his jewelry things away. He picked up some magazines off the floor and shoved them into a crack in the wall. He threw a vest under his bed. No place for a young girl. Then he swam back and came really close to me. He held his hands up to my face, and I forced myself not to move. He cradled the each side of my faces with his palms, stroking my dimple with his thumb, and wiped the tears away as they mingled with the seawater. Emily! That came out a little sharper than I meant to. Emily, he whispered at last. It was him, my dad. A second later, I clutched him as tightly as I could, and he was holding me in strong arms. A mermaid as well, he murmured into his half. Only some of the time, I said. Figures. He loosened his arms and held me away from him. Where's your mother? He asked suddenly. Is she here? Is she all right? He dropped his arms to his side. Has she met someone else? I inched closer to him. Of course she hasn't met anyone else. My Penny, he smiled. Penny? My lucky Penny. That's what I always called her. Guess I wasn't too accurate in the end. Then he smiled. But she hasn't forgotten me. Um, how was I supposed to tell her to answer that? She still loves you? Well, she did, didn't she? She must, or she wouldn't have been so upset when she remembered everything, and she hasn't really forgotten you, at least not anymore. Not anymore? Listen, I'll tell you everything, and I did. I told him about the memory drugs and Mr. Beeston, and about what happened when I took Mom to the Rainbow Rocks, and about our journey to the Great Murmur Reef. So she is here, he broke in. She's that close, right now. I nodded. He flattened his hair down, spun around in circles, and swam away from me. Dad! Dad! I still couldn't get used to that. She's waiting for me. She can't get into the prison. I followed him over the table. She can't swim, I added softly. He burst out laughing as he turned to face me. Can't swim? What are you talking about? She's the smoothest, sleekest swimmer you could find, excluding mermaids, of course. My mom? A smooth, sleek swimmer? I laughed. I guess that disappeared along with the memory, he said sadly. We swam all over. She even took scuba lessons so she could join me under the water. We went to that old shipwreck. That's where I proposed, you know. She definitely still loves you, I said again, I, thinking of the poem and even more sure now. Yeah. He swam over to the table by his bed. I followed him. What's that? I asked. There was something pinned onto the wall with a fishhook. A poem. That's mine. My voice cracked. That's mine, he said miserably. The Forsaken Merman? I read. I scanned the lines, not really taking any of it in, until I came to one stanza that made me gasp out loud. A ceiling of amber, a pavement of pearl. But that's, yeah, I know. Soppy old stuff, isn't it? No, I know those lines. Jake looked up at me. How, have you been to that shipwreck yourself? I'm gonna read that again because I lost track where I was. Have you been to that shipwreck yourself, little one? I nodded. Shona took me, my friend. She's a mermaid. And your mother? No, she doesn't know I've been there. Jake dropped his head. But she knows those lines, I said. I pulled the poem off the wall, reading on. She left lonely forever, the kings of the sea, I said out loud. That's how it ends, he said. But it's not. Not what? That's not how it ends. It does. Look here. Jake swam over, took the poem from me. Those are the last lines. I snatched it back. But that's not how your story ends. She never left the king of the sea. Jack scratched his head. You've lost me now. The king of the sea. That's our boat. That's what it's called. His eyes went all misty like Mom's had earlier. So it is love. I remember when we renamed it. I forgot what her father had called it before that. But you see, And she could never leave it. She told me that, and now I know why. Because it's you. She could never leave you. You're not the forsaken mermaid man at all. Jake laughed. You really think so? Then he pulled me close again. He smelled of salt. His chin was bristly against my forehead. Look, you'll need to go soon, he said, holding me away from him. But I've only just found you. The dinner bell is about to ring, and we need to get you out of here. I don't know how you got your way into this place, little gem, but you're sure as sharks not don't want to get caught here. Might never get out again. Don't you want me? He held my hand and looked deep into his eyes, locking us into a world of our own. I want you alive, he said. I want you free and happy. I don't want you slammed up in some stupid place like this for the rest of your life. I'll never see you again, I said sadly. We'll find a way, little gem. I liked how he called me that. Come on, he said, looking quickly from side to side. We need to get you out of here. He opened his door and looked down into the corridor. How come you can do that? I asked. Aren't you supposed to be locked up in here? He pointed to a metal tag stapled on the end of his tail. Doesn't that hurt? Keeps me in place. If I take it across the threshold, he pointed at the doorway, and I know that talking about. It's like being slammed between two walls. You tried it? He rubbed his head as though he had just bashed it. Not to be advised, I tell you. I giggled. Why have doors then? He shrugged. Extra security? They lock them at night. He swam back towards me. You understand, don't you? I think so. I suddenly remembered Mr. Beeston's words. How he said my dad ran off because he didn't want to be saddled with a baby. But Mr. Beeston had lied about everything, hadn't he? What is it, little one? I looked down at my tail, flicking rapidly from side to side. You didn't leave because it's not that you didn't want me back then, I said. What? He suddenly swam over to his bed. I totally scared him off. I wish I could take the words back. He reached under the bed. Look at this. Pulled a pile of plastic papers out. Take a look. Any of them. I approached him shyly. Go on, he urged. Have a look. He passed me one. It was a poem. I read it aloud. I never thought I'd see the day they'd take my bonny bairn away. I long for her every day. Alas, she is so far away. Yeah, well, it was an early one, he said, pulling at his ear. There's better than that in here. I couldn't take my eyes off the poem. Yeah, yeah, I know. Jewelry poetry. What next, eh? He made a face. But before I could say anything else, a bell started ringing. It sounded like the school fire alarm. I clapped my hands over my ears. That's it. Dinner. They'll be here soon. He grabbed me. Emily, you have to go. Can I keep it? I asked. He folded the poem up and handed it back to me. Then he held my arms tightly. I'll find you, he said roughly. One day, I promise. He swirled around, picked up the bracelet from his bedside table, and quickly tied a knot onto it. Give this to her mother. Tell her. He paused. Just tell her that no matter what, I never stopped loving her, and I never will. Ever. You hear me? I nodded, my throat too clogged up to speak. He hugged me one last time before swirling around again. Hang on. He pulled the poem off his wall and handed it to me. Give her this as well, and tell her to keep it till we're together again. Tell her to never forsake me. She won't, Dad. Neither of us will, ever. I'll find you, he said again, his voice croaky. Now go. He pushed me through the door. Be quick and be careful. I edged down to the corridor and held his eyes for a second. See you, Dad, I whispered. Then he closed the door and was gone. I wavered for a moment in the empty corridor. The bell was still shrieking. It was even louder outside the cell. I covered my ears, flicked my tail, and got moving back along the corridors into the cleaning cupboard, through the tiny hole, out across the murky darkness until I found the tunnel again. Shona was waiting at the end of it, just like she had said she would be. We fell into each other's arms and laughed as we hugged each other. I was so worried, she said. You were gone for ages. I found him, I said simply. Swishy, she breathed. Tell you all about it on the way. Come on. I was desperate to see Mo. I couldn't wait to see her face when I gave her Dad's presents. So tell me again. Mom twirled her new bracelet around her wrist, watching the colors blur and merge, then refocus and change again, while Millie looked on jealously. What he did he say exactly? Mom, I told you 3 times already. Just once more, darling. Then that's it. I sighed. He's I sighed. He said he's always loved you, and he always will, and he had stacks of poems that he'd written. She clutched her poem more tightly. About me, I thought of the one in my pocket. Well, yeah, mostly. Mom smiled in a way I'd never seen before. I laughed. She was acting like the woman in those horrible, gooey romantic films that she loved. Mom, we have to see him again, I said. He's never stopped loving me, and he never will, she replied dreamily. Millie raised her eyebrows. A second later, a huge splash took a smile off her face. We ran outside, one over me, trying to get one over me, trying to get one over on me. I keep trying to miss on. It was Mr. Beaston in the water. How'd he get past us? After everything I've done for you, he called, swimming rapidly away from us as he spoke. Why, what are you going to do? I shouted. I warned you, he shouted, paddling backwards. I won't let you get away with it. Then, in a quiet voice, his words almost washed away by the waves, he said, I'm sorry I had to end like this, Mary P. I'll always remember the good times. And then he turned and swam towards the great murmur reef. Mom and I looked at each other. Good times? Millie cleared her throat. It's all my fault, she said quietly. Mom turned to Millie. What? I loosened the ropes. Millie pulled her shawl around her, only a tiny bit. He said they were hurting. Mom sighed and shook her head. All right, don't worry, Millie, she said. There's nothing we can do now, is there? As we watched Mr. Beeson swim off into the distance, Shona appeared in the water below us. What's up? She called. I thought I heard something going on. It's Mr. Beeson, I said. He's gone. Escaped. He went over there. I pointed towards the prison. I think he's up to something. Should we go after him? You girls are not going back there, Mom said. Not now. It's too dangerous. What then? I asked. How will we get back? We don't have any fuel. The sail's broken. Shona can't tow us all the way back to the harbor. We could radio the Coast Guard, Mom said. Mom, the radio's been broken for years. You always said you'd get it fixed at some point. But I kept forgetting. Mom finished my sentence with a sigh. We could always meditate on it, Millie offered. See if the answers come to us. Mom and I both glared silently at her. 10 seconds later, the decision was taken out of our hands. A loud voice warbled up from below the surface of the sea. You are surrounded, it gurgled. You must give yourselves to up. Do not try to resist. Who are you? I shouted. I'm not afraid of Emily. Mom gripped my arm. The voice spoke again. You are outnumbered. Do not underestimate the powers of Neptune. Before I could think about what to say next, 4 mermen in prison guard uniforms, each appeared on the surface of the water. Each one had an upside-down octopus on his back. It was in perfect formation. I see them. Uh, in perfect formation, they leaped from the water, their tails spinning like whirlpools. They flapped on their sides, the octopus legs swirling above their backs like rotary blades, and headed towards us. Between them, they plucked Millie, Mom, and me from the deck and spun themselves around and held us under their arms as they plopped back into the water. I can't swim, Mom yelped. For an answer, she was dragged silently underwater, gulping and gasping. We were shoved roughly into a weird tube thing. My legs started turning into a tail right away, but for once, I hardly noticed. We slid along the tube, sliding on a bouncy floor. The entrance we slid through instantly closed, leaving us staring at the inside of a white rubbery bubble. 2 masks hung from the ceiling. They looked like the things they show you when you go on a plane. I grabbed hold of them and helped Mom and Millie put them on. Then we sat in silence as we bumped along through the water. Millie pulled some worry beads out of her pocket and twirled them furiously around her fingers. Mom clutched her fingers, holding them so tight it hurt. We'll be fine, I said, putting my arms around her. Then in an uncertain whisper, I added, I'm sure we will. I hope you guys enjoyed chapter 14. Thank you for being here, and I'll let me go. Peace.